All right, welcome back, everyone. We'll now hear a presentation from Andrew Young, who is the Knowledge Director at the Gov Lab, where he leads research on the impact of technology on public institutions. At the Gov Lab, and with the recently concluded MacArthur Foundation Research Network on Open and Governance, he undertakes collaborative action research projects with institutional partners across sectors and disciplines. Please keep in mind that the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your Zoom webinar window, will be open throughout the presentation. So feel free to post questions on Zoom throughout the session, and then we'll address them in the second portion. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Grace. It's great to be here. And thanks to everyone for joining and coming back from your break on a Friday afternoon. So let me see if I can successfully share my slides here, and then we'll dive in. Great, hopefully you can see my screen now. Perfect, great. So as Grace said, I'm Andrew Young. I am here from the Gov Lab at New York University, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our work around responsible data collaboration and stewardship, and a little bit on how that relates specifically to water management issues. But I should lead off by saying that we are a cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral type of organization, so we don't focus on one particular vertical or level of governance or region. We're pretty global and agnostic in terms of focus area in terms of our scope. So the GovLab is, as Grace mentioned, an action research center at New York University. And the way that we tend to organize ourselves is around the idea that as a result of access to new technologies, public institutions and those working in the public interest increasingly have access to two new types of assets that could inform their decision-making and improve governance. The first is new models of collaboration and new ways to tap into the collective intelligence of diverse groups of people. And then the second, surprise, surprise, given the focus of this talk, is data. And when we look at data, we talk about it in various types of forms and from various different sources, whether it be public sector data, private sector data, institutional data, administrative data, small data, big data, across the board. So what we do at the GovLab is partner with institutions to really define new methodologies to tap into these collective intelligence and data assets to improve their decision-making, test out new methodologies, and see really whether it works better in practice. So moving to the specific topic at hand, which of course is water, I'm gonna start out with a couple of examples here that, given the interests of everyone involved in this discussion, you might already be familiar with. But the first one is something called the California Data Collaborative. And it's a nonprofit partnership among California-based utility agencies and other local stakeholders to automate the collection and analysis of metered water use. This pooled information results in a more accurate data set and a more robust understanding of how much, when, and where water is being used by California residents, ultimately to better inform water policy and operational decision-making. And then the second example, in part of Zanesville, Ohio, which is a small city not too far from my hometown of Beaver County, Pennsylvania, access to public water was inequitable for over 50 years. The primarily white part of town was connected to the public water lines, and the primarily Black part of town disconnected and forced to rely on purifying rainwater or trucking water back to their homes from the nearest water tower. In 2008, a number of residents forced to deal with this inequitable water access situation engaged a civil rights law firm who leveraged open geolocation and water utility data, as well as information on town demographics obtained through a door-to-door survey to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt what the Black community already knew, that water access was discriminatory. So the residents who brought suit against the city won an $11 million settlement as a result of this access to data. So both of these projects are examples of what we call data collaboratives, which are a new form of data partnership involving actors from different sectors coming together to share data assets and expertise to address public problems. Data collaboratives are premised on the idea much of the most useful data remains locked away in institutional silos and not made accessible to those who could most effectively use it in the public interest. So I just gave two positive, inspirational examples of data collaboration as it relates to water management. But of course, gaps still clearly exist. So this article on the screen here is a recent piece in DevX that outlines some findings from a report on how poor data on groundwater is impeding water management and potentially jeopardizing climate resilience efforts in places like Bangladesh, Ghana, India, Nepal, and Nigeria. In fact, the lack of data collaboration between government authorities and other institutions involved in groundwater data collection, plus a lack of a centralized database collecting relevant information and making accessible to these different parties, are both seen as root causes of these information gaps and the risks and challenges as it relates to effective water management and climate resilience efforts. So here, I think this graphic speaks for itself. Just kidding. So much of our study on data collaboration and stewardship really focuses on mechanisms for moving from data to insight and from insight to action. So I'm not going to go through this whole complicated little infographic here that we've been noodling on at the GovLab for a while. But really the key messages here are that we have data here at the center, which is collected and held by various actors in the public, private, and civil sectors. Often that data, or potentially sometimes that data, is made accessible to parties who could put it to positive use through various models of data collaboration, including the type of public interfaces and open data efforts that enabled the Zanesville case that I mentioned, as well as things like data pooling projects that are driving the California Data Collaborative that I discussed, as well as efforts to create prize-back challenges around access to data and others. These data collaboratives can then lead to new insights as it relates to things like situational analysis, better understanding conditions on the ground, enabling new types of experimentation, better understanding correlation and potentially cause and effect causation, and also enabling more effective prediction and forecasting. Ultimately, moving from that insight to meaningful action often relies on certain enabling conditions and actions. Some of the ones that we see quite often are a focus on purpose-driven data collaboration or publishing with purpose, fostering useful partnerships, prioritizing really targeted localized efforts, and centering data responsibility throughout the effort. And then ultimately, the action that this kind of data collaboration and the insights that are derived from it can create are things like empowering people through new access to information that they might not have had before, enabling more effective decision-making or advocacy efforts. So Zanesville is a clear example of that one, as well as things like more effective governance and service delivery in California, solving big public problems, very much related to the Zanesville case as well, and much of the work around crisis response and disaster management through data use, and then also creating new types of economic opportunity and innovation. So sounds great, but it's rarely that simple, and I wouldn't call that a particularly simple graphic either. But there are clearly some major challenges that have slowed the impact that could be created through this kind of data collaboration, I would argue, in the water management space, but also more broadly. So much of our work on unlocking this public value of data focuses on how we can make this type of data collaboration more systematic, more sustainable, and more responsible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a few of the projects that we have going on, but I am sensitive to the time and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to get into the Q&A as well. So on the systematic issue, the way decisions are made about investment in and experimentation with data collaboration and data stewardship are often driven by what data happens to be available, rather than the most pressing problems that could be addressed through data that might be held elsewhere. We also see initiatives that are targeted at only the lowest hanging fruit, or taking a data-driven approach to challenges that are most effectively or exclusively solved through other means. So this 100 questions project is something that we've been working on for about a year now, which is a cross-domain effort to identify the 100 questions that would be most impactful if answered, and importantly, could be answered through new access to an analysis of different types of data. So those 100 questions are going to ultimately span 10 different domains, including, so we've already launched domains around migration, air quality, disinformation, the future of work. We're getting ready to do some work around governance, racial inequality, and agriculture and food. We have room for a water management project as well, and I would be very eager to get into that realm. And the way that we identify these 100 questions, rather than sitting at GovLab, I was going to say sitting in our office in Brooklyn, but we are clearly not sitting in our office in Brooklyn at this point. But we don't come up with these questions ourselves. Rather, we engage what we call a cohort of bilinguals. And here we mean bilinguals that have both domain area expertise as well as data science expertise. So who is the person who knows everything there is to know about the substance of water management issues, but also happens to be a data scientist working on those issues in a public, private, civil sector, academic institution? What does that person think is the most essential question that could be answered through data that should really drive data collaboration work and really target the use of data around questions that really matter and problems that could be solved through this type of data analysis? The second issue is around this sustainability question. And too often we see data collaboratives and data reuse projects that are ad hoc, quickly abandoned, or fail to move beyond the piloting stage. And this, we argue, in part arises from a lack of professionals specifically mandated to enable purposeful, responsible data collaboration in both data holding supply side organizations in the public, private, and civil sectors, as well as actors working in the public interest that represent the demand for that data. So we call these actors who help to determine if, when, and how to create and sustain data collaboratives, data stewards. And we're working in a variety of projects to facilitate this type of responsible data leadership in businesses and institutions around the world, and really defining what those roles and functions would be that would help to unlock this data and create what we call that kind of human infrastructure that could support data collaboration and stewardship. Then on the issue of responsible, we have a number of projects looking at how we can support more responsible data use in various types of sectors, including some work with the World Resources Institute around how they can assess the sensitivity of different types of data. But here I have on the screen a project that we've done with UNICEF, which really made clear how data risks and strategies for ensuring data responsibility are highly contextual. So through this project, which involved a number of field visits to UNICEF country offices to understand how data handling is working in practice and the policies, principles, and procedures that are driving that work, we established a set of what we're calling the Responsible Data for Children principles to inform more safe and effective handling of data for and about children. And those principles are participatory, protective of children's rights, prevention of harms across the data lifecycle, proportional, people-centric, and purpose-driven. They are the 7 Ps, and that's why I can always rattle them off pretty effectively. And then also a set of flexible tools and suggested good practice to support responsible decision-making in this handling of data for and about children. But ultimately, these types of responsible data frameworks, guidelines, and principles need to be implemented in a manner that takes into account the unique opportunities and risks associated with the stakeholders involved, the intended beneficiaries, and other contextual issues. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to data responsibility. So some of our field work on the RD4C project involved engaging with WASH professionals in Romania versus in Kenya versus in Afghanistan. And of course, those questions of what types of data have particular sensitivities or require certain types of duties of care are going to be, while there are some certain common elements and common expectations, there are also a number of very contextual issues. So then the last project that I'll mention very briefly is an effort that we launched here in New York City and are actually getting ready to share the outputs of this effort on Monday. So I'm happy to share that, that link once it goes live. And this, again, kind of speaks to that contextual question as it relates to data responsibility. So in many contexts, we lack real insight into the perceptions regarding opportunities, risks, and responsibilities related to data use and reuse. So in New York City, over the summer here, we held what we called the Data Assembly, which was a citizens assembly bringing together different stakeholder groups involved in data reuse, specifically as it relates to the use of data to address COVID-19 here in New York. So we brought together a mini public of data holders and policymakers, a mini public of civil rights and advocacy groups, and a mini public of regular New Yorkers from across the 5 boroughs to have a really focused discussion around what those issues would be that they deem to be most important in ensuring responsible handling of various types of data to address COVID-19. I won't get into a lot of detail, but we did try to focus that discussion around particular types of use cases. So we tried to move beyond this kind of survey model and not to disparage surveys, that they certainly have a lot of utility, but in this case, we wanted to move beyond the idea that we can ask citizens, are you comfortable or supportive of your data being reused to help address COVID-19? Yes, no, maybe. That doesn't tell us a whole lot, but if we're speaking to things like, what are your opinions on which types of actors might be able to responsibly leverage aggregated mobility data drawn from your cellular telephone to better understand adherence to social distancing provisions in your neighborhood and how policymakers can more effectively support social distancing, for example, then that becomes more of a useful discussion that we can really get into the nuts and bolts of what is or is not appropriate and potentially valuable. So the way that we went about this was to really focus on these questions of why, what, who, how, when, and where as it relates to data reuse and data responsibility. And I'm not going to talk about all of these because we're already, I do want to make sure we have time for Q&A, but just to say that these are different design principles that came out of these mini publics that we synthesized into this, this framework that we're calling a responsible data reuse framework that is going to be put to use specifically as it relates to COVID-19 here in New York City with different actors, but really gives a signal more generally of the many different considerations and principles that can and should drive responsible data use in different types of contexts as well. So happy to discuss that in more detail, as well as any of the other projects or ideas that I just mentioned here. So thanks so much.
So we did have a few questions that came in during the Q&A. And so the first one was, do you see issues with how integrating open data approaches can impact how long decision-making can take? How can you manage these?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think that issue of timeliness as it relates to data is a big one. And it's one of the reasons why we often see those working in the public interest looking to private sector data sources rather than just open data ones, just due to the kind of velocity of the data being generated, cleaned, processed, made accessible, and then ultimately available for reuse. So yeah, that issue of government data sets and the time scale it takes for that to actually be made accessible to the public is definitely a major issue. And I think that's one of the reasons that data collaboratives that involve private sector data holders are really kind of coming to the forefront.
That makes sense. And now we have another question that's focused on resiliency. So what is your opinion on how data can be used to create resilient frameworks to provide equitable water access? And how do different communities get a hold of data or learn to collect data? It's a big question.
It's a big question.
It's kind of what we're all here to discuss, actually. So, like, if it was this easy. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I am tempted to put this back to you, Grace, and to your colleagues here, but
Yeah,
I will
absolutely.
just. Oh well, then please.
Oh, no. I mean, I think it's fair. It's on all of us to kind of think about that question and about what are we trying to answer with the data. I think that's always something that I struggle with is we can collect a lot of data, but how do we get to insights? We have to understand what we want to see or what we're trying to collect and the trends we're trying to show.
That's a better answer than I would have had. But
sorry to steal your thunder. We're
no,
here to
no,
see you.
No, I asked. That was great. No, but I think that's exactly right. And really kind of from a meta perspective, that's the type of approach that I would suggest, which is really having that targeted discussion around identifying the questions that could be answered to make progress toward that bigger objective, because there is no one answer for how this will work. It's going to be stepwise to have this kind of transformative impact. And whenever you look to the people who have really deep expertise in these issues and can identify, well, if we only knew this, then that would be the next step in the process. It's not a satisfying answer, probably in some ways.
But I think that goes back to your domain expertise. As you were saying, like it's important that these people are data scientists and they're domain experts, and that's how we drive to insight, I should say, and then hopefully impact. And I guess following up on that, I think there's always a concern around bad data and what bad data, or I guess misrepresentative data, I think could be bad data, but maybe you can explain like what bad data looks like. I think, is it no data? Is it misrepresentative data? Which is worse to you? And then also what are kind of the risks and how do we protect from making bad decisions based on unrepresentative data?
Yeah, it's another big question. It's a really good one, because ultimately that question of, is moderately high quality data better than no data? And that's another one of those questions that's so highly contextual, because sometimes having some signal is better than kind of working fully in the dark. But ultimately, if that data is driving decision making and service delivery, then that leads to real risks of not addressing, and whether we're talking about personal data or data that supports, again, service delivery that might affect individuals, what is invisible in a data set might lead to ultimately beneficiaries being invisible in the work that is actually meant to support them, whether it's around water access or other issues. But the other related question that we often kind of look at, including in our work with UNICEF, but also more generally, is this question of misuse of data as an example of data irresponsibility, but also the question of misuse of data, in the sense that if you have a data breach or you make a decision based on faulty data that impacts people, clearly that is an example of being irresponsible with data and having that misuse of that data. But if you also have on your hard drive buried somewhere a data set that could actually improve people's lives if someone actually acted on it in some way, that's not a particularly responsible use of that data either. So that's why we always really try to avoid, while recognizing the very clear risks and harms that data can create in various contexts, also recognizing that there are opportunities, and being really purposeful in how we think about how we weigh those risks and opportunities is really important to help us derive that value from data while mitigating the many types of risks and not letting data that could improve people's lives go kind of unused.
That makes sense. And we actually just had a question very related come in. How do you decide who is entitled to data access? If developed countries have opportunities to take and analyze data, should they be responsible for taking and analyzing data from areas that don't have the same infrastructure or resources? And I think maybe even one step further, like sharing results or insights with those places that they're maybe taking data from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's these are great questions. No,
our audience is really doing well. Yeah.
Well, and our moderator, but yeah, no, it's a really important question. And that's one of the reasons why, again, the data assembly was focused on New York City. So not a developing context and specifically around COVID-19, but that was one of the reasons that we really wanted to have that focused discussion on that why, what, who, where, when, because it makes a difference who's accessing the data. It makes a difference who is actually empowered to use that data in some way. So there are these, the general open data, open government data model where data is made accessible to everyone because it doesn't have, or it shouldn't have, any real sensitivities attached to it, at least theoretically. But these more sensitive or data that might have, potential risk attached to them, or competitive advantage concerns, or data sovereignty concerns, which is another concept that a lot of people are focusing on these days. That gets into a trickier discussion, and again, a more of a contextual discussion around who is an appropriate actor to be involved in that. So one of the things that we discussed in this data assembly was, we framed this around a set of what we call data reuse exhibits. So having really concrete examples of, like I mentioned, the mobility data analysis project. Another one around an economic development agency in the public sector analyzing anonymized and aggregated consumer data from a credit card company. Questions like that are active in the space, and really getting into the, well, what are your feelings about the what in terms of what that data is? Are you comfortable with that data being used in different ways? But then on that who question, really getting into that discussion of, well, are we talking about academic researchers and scholars that are going to be conducting some kind of analysis and then sharing insights from that analysis with public sector actors that can put it to use? Are we talking about direct engagement with a government actor, or potentially, to the question, a foreign government actor that, again, on that data sovereignty issue, might have different types of power dynamics involved that create these different kind of questions? So without focusing on the data assembly specifically, I think that's one of the key kind of ideas that we advocate for, is really having that type of nuanced who, what, why, where kind of discussion with stakeholders, which includes beneficiaries and intended beneficiaries and community groups and community leaders, to identify what would be appropriate in terms of actors and different models for deriving some kind of value from different types of data sets. I do, to the question's point, I only see anonymous attendee. Otherwise, I would call you by your name rather than being cryptic. But there are, as I said, kind of those data sovereignty and power dynamic and power asymmetry questions, especially when you're talking about a rich developed country having people who are at least nominally working in the public interest kind of parachuting into a developing country to take data and analyze it in some way. That there are certainly different sensitivities involved there that need to be teased out.
And what about kind of the literacy of maybe the people you're talking to, and about, do they fully understand maybe what they're agreeing to when in terms of like letting someone else have access to their data? And is that ever a concern of really understanding, making sure that whoever you're speaking with understands what they're kind of giving up in a sense, or giving you the right to?
Yeah, it's a huge question for sure. And I should say the projects that I mentioned, while we do some work around kind of practical data collaboration, we were talking more generally about things that are happening in the space rather than things that we're directly driving. But that data literacy issue and data competency issue came up again and again, especially as it relates to kind of, as you said, Grace, like, how can you meaningfully consent to a project? Or how can you meaningfully provide input in terms of, well, this model might make me uncomfortable in some way, or I might opt out of this. But if you used a safe sandbox environment, then maybe I would be more comfortable. that's a difficult discussion to have, even with pretty data literate and kind of sophisticated in terms of data knowledge type of folks. So that question of how do we drive that data literacy is a really important one, and that's actually on the data assembly project specifically, and we're hoping that this is a model that we could replicate elsewhere. We actually co-hosted those deliberations with the New York Public Library System and the Brooklyn Public Library System. And part of the idea in our kind of deliberations with the public was to not just ask for their opinions on these different projects, but also to gauge whether they were familiar with some of these key ideas. So before getting into the project where we talked about citizen reporting through the 311 system being made accessible as open data, the first question is, do you know what open data is? Have you heard the term? Do you know what it is? Have you heard the term, or do you have absolutely no idea? And then we would define it so that we could have a more sophisticated discussion around it. But one of the ideas coming out of this data assembly work is to actually translate those findings and some of these insights from the deliberations into that kind of data literacy training materials. Because, I think in earlier days of the open data movement, there was a lot of discussion around, and anyone can use data. And I think that anyone could benefit from data. There's no question about that. But I don't think that it's fully realistic to think that everyone is going to become kind of a hobbyist data scientist. Mm-hmm. But there is that need to really just have a level of familiarity and literacy with these concepts, just to really even act as a knowledgeable kind of participant in how your data, which we often say a data is in some ways an extension of yourself, how that's being used by different actors. So that literacy issue and how we can support it, even if we aren't turning everyone into a data scientist, is a really important question.
And then we have another question here that's kind of changing directions, but how can we incentivize private sector involvement here, and what do they have to gain?
It's a great question. And we do a lot of our data collaboration work actually focusing specifically on those types of private sector data sets that might be valuable. And I think an important first issue that I want to raise is just when we talk about data collaboration or data stewardship, we're often try to be careful about not always framing it as opening data or as sharing data per se, because quite often, especially when it's a private sector entity or that data is highly sensitive, whether it's held by a civil sector actor or someone else, fully sharing that data, especially raw data, is not going to be tenable in a lot of ways. So we tend to frame it more in terms of how do you provide functional access to data? How do you share? In some cases, it might be pre-processed but relatively granular data that isn't too sensitive, or done in a really kind of closed environment. In other cases, it might be sharing insights from data that doesn't actually involve sharing the raw data. In other cases, we see some interesting models of what we tend to call bringing the algorithm to the data, in the sense that we did a project in Santiago de Chile around understanding women and girls' mobility patterns in Santiago in comparison to men and boys, to understand how we can take a more gender equitable lens to urban planning, access to transportation and the like.
Sure.
We did that with a telecom company, and CDRs are highly, highly, highly sensitive data. So there was no appetite on any side of this arrangement to actually share that data, to email a big spreadsheet with a bunch of that kind of information. Rather, our data science partners in Santiago and some based in Italy actually had to go to the headquarters of this Telefonica data lab, do their analysis on the Telefonica server, and walk out with their insights essentially on a piece of paper with none of that data actually changing hands. So bringing the questions and the analytical models to the data and then coming out with aggregated and anonymized information that doesn't get into that really sensitive data. But that's kind of speaking about guardrails, but on the issue of incentives, there are a few different models and kind of drivers of these kind of data collaboratives from different contexts. In some cases, we often call data collaboratives a new form of corporate social responsibility. So some folks are involved just because they see it as an opportunity to do good with their data and be kind of a good private sector citizen. In other cases, we see reciprocity being a key issue. So especially in cases like data pools involving different private sector actors, there's an interesting project called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership here in the States, where pharmaceutical companies are actually sharing some of their research and development data with the NIH, with the FDA, but also with one another. So 10 pharmaceutical companies sharing some of their data, but they also get 9 of their competitors'
companies
data
back.
as
Yeah,
well.
that's interesting.
So you have that reciprocity. In some jurisdictions, there's actually a regulatory expectation. In France and the UK in particular, there are certain regulations that mandate sharing data with the government specifically. So those are some of the key ones. And then the last one, I guess, would be it is a useful kind of reputation boost for private sector companies to do this kind of, again, corporate social responsibility work. So you always want to be careful that it's not kind of
with
data collaboration theater in the interest of putting out a press release with no meaningful action behind it. But that is definitely a clear incentive of having that signal that you are doing good work and you are contributing to solving real problems that are affecting people's lives.
That's great. We've actually gone over time, but thank you so much, Andrew. This has been such a great discussion. I know I've learned a lot. I'm sure our audience members have too. And with that, we'll actually head to a break before our next keynote speaker, which will start in only 3 minutes. So it'll be a short break. But thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate having you. And this has been a great addition to kind of our conversation on data and data use. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Grace. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Oh, I guess I should say, if you want to continue the discussion for any audience members out there, we can actually go to the breakout room, and I will put the link in the chat. And Andrew, if you have time to go there as well, we would love to keep the conversation going.
Sure.
You have a few minutes, but here, the link is right in the chat for all of our participants. And there should be a continuation of this discussion there as well. Thank you guys so much.